Chilling tales for dark nights.
Collector. Written by Meagan Meehan. Performed by Todd Farrell. Featuring Aidan Ordover, Aaron Ordover, and Jesse Cornett. Before the poster entered his life, Ethan didn't believe in monsters or ghosts or anything supernatural. Even at the tender age of 11, his mind was deeply rooted in the real world. Science was his passion, and he dreamed about becoming an archaeologist. The very thought of uncovering dinosaur bones filled him with glee. Science class was the highlight of his life. For starters, there was a replica of a dinosaur skeleton that took up residence on Miss Ashby's desk. Ethan was so enthralled by it that he sometimes dreamt about it. Then there was Miss Ashby herself. She was young and nice. Moreover, she liked Ethan. She didn't just accept or tolerate him. She genuinely liked him. She also encouraged him to pursue his dreams. Miss Ashby made Ethan want to succeed. He was good at drawing, which was important because archaeologists sketched a lot, and he was good at remembering information, which was imperative for any class, especially science. Some people considered dinosaurs to be monsters, and that was fitting, since some dinosaurs were predatory carnivores. Ethan supposed that was why they so fascinated him. Dinosaurs were monstrous, but they were monsters that had actually existed, unlike the stupid zombies that staggered around in the ridiculous horror movies which James was so addicted to. James was both Ethan's cousin and the bane of his life. 10 years older than Ethan, he was a perpetual slacker who continuously found himself out of work and out of luck. James had never been what one would have called a straight shooter. Both Aunt Samantha and Uncle Hector doted on their only son, and either chose to ignore his many flaws or were truly blind to them. Ethan found the latter hard to believe. At age 5, his cousin's claim to fame was his penchant for sticking crayons up his nose. But anyone who spoke to his mother would think that James was destined to become the next Einstein. For his part, James blamed Ethan for everything that went wrong, not only in his life, but in the world at large. As far as James was concerned, his life had been permanently marred when Ethan had come to live with the family. Ethan's mother, Susan, had gotten pregnant by the town drunk, a man aptly named Joe Barr. Joe repeatedly found himself in and out of prison, or the Crowbar Motel as Uncle Hector called it, throughout the tumultuous 2-year marriage. When Ethan was 3, his father took a bottle of whiskey on a hike in the woods and proceeded to fall into the river and drown. By that time, the Barr family was living in a rundown shack, and his mother resorted to government assistance to get by. Ethan often wondered why Aunt Samantha and Uncle Hector, who had a nice split-level home and 2 cars, never tried to help more. He had occasionally seen Aunt Samantha and Uncle Hector on Christmas Eve or Easter Friday when they dropped off some gifts and warm meals, but James never accompanied them on these trips, and they never appeared on the actual holidays. Ethan later learned that Aunt Samantha thought the shack had bugs and mold, and she didn't want such a place to contaminate her precious son. The first time Ethan met James was when he moved in with him, after his mother dropped dead of a heart attack whilst shopping for groceries. Ethan had been in school at the time, but he heard that she'd been dead before she hit the tiled floor of the chilly dairy aisle. Ethan admitted that Aunt Samantha had been right about the bugs. His old house had been so completely infested with spiders, ants, and roaches that he'd actually come to consider them pets. But she was totally wrong about her precious son, since there was nothing particularly precious, or even likable, about James Paul Sinclair. James had a mile-wide mean streak laced with sneakiness. Deep down, James was jealous of his baby cousin, the invader. Uncle Hector had long since ceased complaining about the perpetual guest and simply accepted the situation, something James apparently found impossible to do. He missed his life as an only child, a peaceful existence that Ethan had stolen from him, and, subconsciously or otherwise, James was determined to make the little brat pay. Ethan didn't believe that his aunt and uncle outright hated him, but he was not equal to their precious son, and he was reminded of that fact all too frequently. Once, 2 weeks after moving in, Ethan got up to get a glass of water in the middle of the night and caught James trying to sneak out. Ethan threatened to tell on him, which proved to be a colossal mistake. James grabbed him by the collar and yelled for his parents, claiming that he'd caught Ethan trying to sneak away. Even though Ethan was in pajamas and James was fully clothed at 3 a.m., neither adult ever questioned their son's version of events. That was simply standard practice in the house of Sinclair. Of course, everyone had their limits, even Aunt Samantha. James instinctively knew that if she saw him openly harassing his much younger cousin, she would pitch a fit. Hence, James minded his manners in front of his parents. Everything he did to the younger boy was on the sly, and disguised so well that any accusation on Ethan's part would seem baseless at best and paranoid delusional at worst. Already an adored only child, James kept in his parents' good books by doing errands. He'd mow the lawn, and accidentally plow over any figurines Ethan had left in the front yard. He'd start the dishwasher, and accidentally melt Ethan's favorite plastic crazy straws. He'd help with yard sales and accidentally sell Ethan's favorite puzzles and earth science books. Oh yes, James was a master of seemingly innocent accidents. It had gone on for so many years that Ethan had slowly but surely adapted, making sure to hide his most cherished items and keep as much distance from his older cousin as possible. Material grievances aside, James was just pure annoying. In 4th grade, Ethan had learned the definition of the word intolerable, and it described James perfectly. His mean smirk and slit eyes, his too big clothes and too small brain, the way he ate, the way he talked, all of it intolerable. James liked weird music and bad movies, what Uncle Hector called B-listers, but Ethan thought they seemed more like Z-listers, and even that was being generous. James had a habit of sitting up late, hogging the TV with his weird, gory movies that scared Ethan to death when he was little. As he got older, his interest in science assured him that monsters didn't exist, although idiots did. Idiots like James. As the years wore on, James stopped wrecking Ethan's toys and instead settled for minor physical aggressions, like closing doors in his face, tripping him when he walked by, or occasionally slapping him when nobody else was looking. Ethan quickly adapted and often evaded assault for weeks at a time. Foregoing college, James started working a series of odd jobs and, without actually moving out, spent more time away from home. Sometimes Ethan did too. He'd managed to make some friends at school and attempted sleepovers whenever he could, always at someone else's house, of course. He couldn't imagine subjecting one of his few friends to James's endless passive-aggressive wrath. It was after he arrived home from an awesome sleepover at his friend Michael's house that Ethan first saw the poster. It caught his eye as he was walking down the hall towards his room. Its colors blared obnoxiously from the slightly ajar door. It was one of those cheesy black light pieces consisting of neon hues on black velvet. James's room was a shrine to such materials. His walls were lined with similar posters, most of which showcased skeletons in some form. Skeletons playing guitars, riding motorcycles, or sitting atop horses. The new edition was in the same aesthetic vein, but it was somehow different. There was something darker about it. Something bad. The new poster depicted a skeleton in a Grim Reaper robe. The Grim Skull, Ethan found he dubbed it that in his mind, was holding a fierce-looking spiked staff and had a pile of skulls lying at his feet. This was standard horror movie illustration fare, except there was something deeper to it, something darker. Perhaps it was the grim skull's malicious smirk, or maybe it was the purple robe writhing as his eyes slid over it. It almost looked as though there were faces trapped within its fabric. The sight of it made Ethan shudder, a reaction James instantly seized upon.
"What's the matter, Squirt? Don't you like it?"
Ethan hated being called Squirt, but complaining would only egg James on. He refused to take his eyes off the poster.
It's not my style.
Not enough rainbows, Pansy?
Ethan wasn't exactly sure why James sometimes called him Pansy, but he sensed it was an insult and refused to take the bait. Ethan made a point not to show fear or weakness in front of James again, but the poster disturbed him on a number of levels. For one thing, he couldn't stop looking at it. Every time he walked down the hall past James's room, he stole a peek. And every time it seemed as if the grim skull was situated differently, and the faces in the robe sometimes looked as if they were squirming, thrashing about in never-ending agony. Ethan knew this was just a trick on the eyes, what Miss Ashby called an optical illusion, but it sent chills through him nonetheless. Then there was the matter of why he could even see it in the first place. For years, James had consistently kept his door tightly shut, but since he got the poster, he kept it cracked open just enough for Ethan to get a glimpse of the grim skull several times a day. This, he assumed, was done purposefully. James knew Ethan didn't like the poster, and therefore made it his mission to expose him to it as much as possible. The whole thing was silly, ridiculous even. He had never been afraid of skeletons before.
You want to study them, for God's sake.
Ethan tried to reassure himself whenever he felt as if the grim skull's bony fingers were tracing his spine. As the days wore on, Ethan became increasingly convinced that something was basically wrong with the poster. It didn't only move, it beckoned, and it was hypnotic. At night, he dreamt about the grim skull standing over him, probing his sleeping brain for stray thoughts. On the 5th day of its presence in the house, it enticed Ethan to do something he never thought he would. He entered James's room. From the start of his residence in the house, one thing had been made very clear. James's room was off limits. Once, when he was 7, he had made the terrible mistake of walking in to investigate, spellbound by the lava lamps that James kept on a shelf above his bed. No sooner had he stepped 2 feet into the room than James ran in, grabbed him by his shirt, and started screaming at him. Ethan, surprised, had started to cry, which only made James shake him harder and yell louder. Then Aunt Samantha had run in. She'd gotten James to let go of his little cousin, but she had also sided with her precious son. "This is James's room," she'd scolded Ethan. "We set up a nice room for you. You should be grateful and respect your cousin enough to leave his things alone." Ethan had protested, but James only sneered in response, smugly satisfied in the knowledge that the adults had his back and he would always have the upper hand. Since that fateful day, Ethan had lost any desire to venture into James's room, until now. It was a sunny afternoon, and James was out with friends. Ethan hadn't known he was planning to enter the room until he found himself opening the door. It was messier than he remembered. The carpet hadn't been vacuumed in a while, and there were old clothes and dirty dishes everywhere. Apparently, Aunt Samantha hadn't been in to do her daily cleaning yet. Even at the age of 21, precious James was not expected to pick up after himself.
I left my room like this. They dropped me off at the orphanage.
The idea unsettled Ethan because he suspected that it might be true. Despite the overall disarray of the room, the lava lamps and the posters remained. Actually, there were many more posters than Ethan remembered. They were taped up so close together that it was impossible to see the wall behind them. The Grim Skull poster was the only one separated from the gathered mass on the wall. It hung from James's closet door, grinning malevolently, presiding over the room like a gatekeeper. For a moment, Ethan thought it was cursed, but he quickly chastised himself.
Don't be stupid. It's just an ugly piece of art some hippie did when he was jacked up on LSD. It's just a picture painted with neons. There's nothing special about it.
He glared at it, searching its surface for any sign of movement. It didn't budge.
It's just a drawing. Touch it and you'll see that it's just fabric and paint, nothing more and nothing less.
He inched closer. The poster didn't move. Closer. No change. Closer. It didn't stir.
It's not real.
Ethan had gotten within an inch of it as he whispered aloud. Then, as if in response, the grim skull winked at him.
Ah!
Ethan jumped back and uttered a scream of surprise. He closed and reopened his eyes. The grim skull stared back, unflinching.
It was just your imagination. You're freaking yourself out. James is right. You are a pansy.
Anger and self-disgust surged inside of Ethan. He was supposed to be a scientist in training. He was supposed to be rational. And yet, here he was nearly having a panic attack over a piece of artwork.
I'm not afraid of you.
As he growled out the words, he touched the center of the poster. The pain was sudden and intense, causing him to yelp and jump backwards so quickly that he lost his balance and fell to the floor. Heart pounding, he stared down at his tingling hand.
It shocked me. It gave me some kind of electrical jolt. No, it bit me.
He glanced up at the poster, and the grim skull, which was undeniably smiling wider, stuck its blue snake-like tongue out and wiggled it at him. Aunt Samantha burst into the room within 3 seconds of Ethan's scream, her face a mask of rage as she dragged Ethan out. Yet his angry aunt was the least of his concerns. The poster was alive, or at least it contained something that was alive and menacing and very much supernatural. The idea that the seemingly logical scientific world could evaporate so fast made Ethan's mind feel like it was tearing at the seams. For the first time in his life, he questioned everything. Ethan awoke in an uneasy sweat at 1:36 a.m. to the sound of rustling. He turned towards the door, sure that James would be standing there, perhaps holding a plastic bag and poised to smother him in a fit of rage. When he glanced across the hall into James's room, his stomach dropped a mile. The grim skull was gone. The poster was there, as was the heap of skulls, but the grim skull itself was missing. And something was moving around the house.
It's a burglar! You've got to get up and call the police.
Except it wasn't a burglar, and Ethan knew it. Uncle Hector had the house alarmed better than Fort Knox. Whatever was wandering around hadn't broken in, at least not through a window or a door.
It's just James, or Uncle Hector, or Aunt Samantha getting a midnight snack.
Before he was aware of his intentions, Ethan got out of bed. The carpet felt like ice. The whole house felt colder than a freezer and was pitch black. If not for the moon, there would be no light at all. Tentatively, he crept out of his room and stole a look at James, who was sprawled on his bed, snoring loudly. Ethan continued his journey down the hall toward his aunt and uncle's room. He saw it happen. Too afraid to move or scream, he bore witness in a state of near paralysis. The grim skull was leaning over Aunt Samantha, as if whispering in her ear. It made odd smacking noises, like it was absorbing, eating the air around her. The sound terrified Ethan, because it reminded him of a noise he often thought he heard in his dreams. And the position of the grim skull reminded him too much of all the nights when he'd come half awake, believing it was hovering above him. Now he questioned if those occasions had been dreams at all. Suddenly, the faces stitched into the grim skull's robe noticed Ethan. They locked eyes on him and turned their tormented faces towards his. Then, in unison, they started wailing, warning their master that he was being observed. Ethan retreated down the hall as quickly as possible, feeling a shroud of cold creeping up behind him. The grim skull's guttural laughter filled his ears.
He knew I was there and it didn't care.
Once Ethan reached his room, he slammed the door and slid his heavy dresser drawer in front of it, bolting himself in.
This won't work, but at least I'll get an E for effort.
An E for effort was one of Miss Ashby's favorite expressions.
I wonder what Miss Ashby would say if she saw me now.
Finding the very idea ridiculous, he broke into a frenzy of hysterical laughter. Unable to gain control of himself, he lay on the floor until he cried.
This is what it feels like to lose your mind.
Insanity was certainly the basis behind all of this. Perhaps it was contagious. James never actually told him where he'd gotten the poster, but Ethan knew that he and his loser friends snuck out at night and broke into abandoned buildings to drink and smoke and fool around with girls or whatever else lost causes in their 20s did. Perhaps they'd collected it on one of their illegal excursions into the old Peyton Psychiatric Hospital, or maybe they'd found it in the dump where they sometimes went to shoot rats with BB guns. Its origins were not traceable, but whoever had previously owned it had certainly had their share of problems. In his gut, Ethan knew the poster was not store-bought, and whoever had once owned it was dead. He also knew that his days of pursuing science were over. There was no point in devoting himself to logical endeavors when he now had proof that horror movies were much closer to reality than anyone wanted to believe. Ethan laughed himself to sleep. The next day, he awoke in his sunny room to the sound of Aunt Samantha furiously banging on the door. Ethan tried to tell her about his nightmare, but she wouldn't listen. He had missed the bus, and he was late for school. She hissed that he was too old to be acting like this, and she marched him off sans breakfast. Ethan couldn't concentrate on anything that day. Thoughts of the poster clouded his mind, even in Miss Ashby's class. His friends noticed something wrong, but Ethan declined to tell them about the poster. He didn't want them thinking he was crazy, especially Michael, whose dad was a shrink. By recess, he made up his mind. He couldn't live like this anymore. He decided to confront the grim skull. That night, he waited until everyone was asleep. James didn't drunkenly stagger in until after 2 a.m., and it was 2:43 by the time Ethan felt comfortable enough to tiptoe into James's room.
What if it's gone creeping around the house again?
But he knew it wouldn't be. It was waiting for him. And tonight, its eyes were glowing red. Ethan had already prepared himself to die. It knew he had seen it, and he understood that his estimated chances of survival were little to none. What he didn't understand was how any of this was possible in the first place. Before all of this happened, he had wanted to be a scientist, to explore and discover and indulge his natural curiosity. If he was condemned to die, he might as well spend his last doomed moments investigating. Faintly aware of James's snoring, Ethan locked eyes with the grim skull as he reached out and touched the poster. He fully expected to get sucked into it, but to his surprise, all he felt was cloth and paint, just like a normal poster. Yet there was nothing normal about the grim skull's bony hand that reached out of the frame and snaked down to the closet's door handle. It gripped the knob and turned until the door clicked open. Then the grim skull drew its hand back into the poster, looked down at Ethan, and grinned. James's closet was no longer a closet. Instead of a small space containing jackets and hockey sticks, it now opened up into a strange world. There were trees and paths, valleys and mountains, rivers of neon yellow, overgrown mushrooms, and tiny suns. Everything in the surreal landscape had an unnatural fluorescent glow, but there was no sky, just blackness.
Perhaps this is where all the boogeymen live. It's the realm of monsters.
As he stepped into the domain and heard the closet door slam shut behind him, Ethan felt his sanity waver. There was no way to logically or scientifically explain this. Therefore, he must have gone crazy. It should have been a frightening thought, but instead it was comforting, freeing.
Dead men tell no tales, but the crazy ones have a ton of them.
He walked through the fluorescent maze like a tourist exploring a new city. Everything seemed pretty in a psychedelic way, but there were threats and menaces everywhere. Sharp-toothed jesters beamed at him from behind purple tree trunks. Floating blue eyes watched his every move, and unknown things crept in the pink and orange bushes. The world was filled with odd noises, choruses of calls and growls and clicks, and the unmistakable sound of a guitar riff somewhere far, far away. As he descended deeper into the dreamscape, he noticed neon versions of Aunt Samantha's favorite flowers and the car models that Uncle Hector most admired. He even saw a few of James's beloved cigarettes dancing the jig under a towering crystal ball.
This is what it took from their dreams.
As if to verify this hypothesis, Ethan turned a corner and was met by the dinosaur skeleton from Miss Ashby's class. Except this one wasn't a replica. It was vibrant neon green and very much alive. It turned and stared at him briefly before wandering off towards a field of flowers that looked suspiciously like giant Venus flytraps. As the dinosaur bones shifted themselves away, Ethan realized that they had been blocking the entrance to a deep cave, its darkness akin to a black hole amid a palette of color. Ethan entered the cave and quickly felt himself falling, descending like Alice down the rabbit hole. He landed with surprising grace in a foggy gray landscape that was utterly unlike the manically colored world above. The ground was damp and muddy. It pulled on Ethan's shoes like quicksand, threatening to wrench him down into its murky depths. There were a few puny trees protruding from the land, their deformed branches twisted in misshapen poses. The area looked like a desolate wasteland in the aftermath of a nuclear bomb. In the distance, the grim skull beckoned. Situated amid the dreary landscape, its cloak looked black instead of purple. A proper Grim Reaper. As Ethan approached, the groans from the faces in the cloak wailed, sounding like the wind on a winter night. Ethan assumed he would be one of them soon, but he was too numb to care. He just wanted this to be over. He wanted peace, and death would provide the ultimate rest. Up close, the grim skull was tall and terrible. It was gaunt and haggard, as if it had dug itself out of 1,000 graves. Yet its cloak was brilliant, as were its red eyes, showing an undeniable intelligence and cunning. Its voice was like sandpaper, as if it hadn't spoken aloud in eons.
Do you like my lair, boy? I suppose this is a surprise for you. Oh, one of science. But there is much to the world that you don't know. Both in your realm and others. Oh, yes, boy. There are many other
Ethan felt his mind wince again in the final throes of complete and utter breakdown. The grim skull began to circle him.
You and I are alike. You are an artist, and so am I. Everything that you saw, I created from the dreams of humans. Your species is my muse.
Ethan remained perfectly still as the grim skull leaned into him and whispered into his ear.
In fact, I used to be one of you.
The revelation horrified Ethan. He glanced up at the creature in shock and couldn't ignore the thin mask of flesh that still clung to its bones. Indeed, at some point, this thing had been a man.
I've waited ages to find someone with your skills.
What do you mean?
You will take my place.
No!
The grim skull slid its scaly tongue over its prominent teeth.
This fate has its merits. There are much worse things that can occur in the course of a life.
Name one.
Well, something unfortunate could happen to dear Aunt Samantha and Uncle Hector. Then it would be you and James.
The grim skull's words struck a deep dread into Ethan's very core. The idea of being left at the mercy of James was his worst nightmare.
You can't leave me with him. He would kill me.
Indeed, he would. That's why it would be so much better for you not to mention your aunt and uncle. If you would simply accept your fate.
Ethan looked into the grim skull's red eyes and, for the first time, noticed that they were bloodshot. The creature that had once been human looked tired, weary, exhausted. It needed him to take its place. Ethan realized that in some way it wanted to die, and despite the revolting circumstances, he felt a pang of pity for it.
I'm only 11. Won't I be more useful to you when I'm older?
True, a man is stronger than a boy. But a boy needs time to become a man. And time is something I am in short supply of.
Is there anything I can do?
Fuel.
What?
Fuel. I need fuel. If I'm to maintain my post until you have grown from boy to man, then I need fuel so I can keep the higher realm looking as it does. That is my duty.
What kind of fuel?
Take a guess.
You want me to bring you a person?
I think you'll find it to be a much easier task than you imagined. Leave now. You are missed in your dimension.
What do you mean?
Before Ethan could finish the question, the grim skull raised its hand, and a giant gray stairwell suddenly appeared behind Ethan. Ethan found himself bounding up the stairs towards a door, fully aware that he was not entirely in control of his body. Weakening or not, the grim skull still had a great many powers of persuasion. A strong gust of wind pushed Ethan through the door at the top of the stairs. He tripped over his own feet and landed with a loud thud on the floor of James's room. As he came back into familiar surroundings, he felt his mind recoil, still unable to fully accept the new reality that it had been exposed to. Then rough hands grabbed him and painfully yanked him up by the hair.
What are you doing in my room, you little freak?
James was awake. Judging by the smell of booze on his breath and his unsteady gait, Ethan surmised that he was still considerably intoxicated. There was no possible way to explain.
You were in my closet! What were you doing in there? Playing patty cake with one of your little friends?
James threw Ethan to the floor. He landed hard and whimpered. Unsurprisingly, neither his deep-sleeping aunt nor uncle stirred.
You're such a little pansy baby, you know that? We all would have been so much better off if you died with your drunk loser parents. Now, what were you doing in there? Stealing my stash?
James stumbled towards the closet as Ethan glanced up at the poster and noticed that the grim skull was still missing. That was when the idea came to him.
You're gonna be just like your dead mom. If something's wrong with the oven, then something's wrong with the bun. Those are just the facts, Squirt.
James swung open the closet door and was greeted by the sight of the gray staircase.
What the... Ah!
Before James could even finish his sentence, Ethan leapt up and shoved his cousin as hard as he possibly could. James propelled forward and plummeted down the stairs. As he descended into the foggy realm below, Ethan bellowed after him.
Fuel coming through!
Then he shut the door and hurried back to his room. Somewhere in the distance he thought he heard James screaming and the grim skull laughing. He jumped into bed and entwined himself in the sheets, trembling furiously. Eventually, he slept. Ethan awoke to the sound of Aunt Samantha frantically screaming James's name. She couldn't find him, so she woke Ethan up, and, of course, he couldn't find him either. Then Uncle Hector came home and looked. He found James's collection of liquor in his otherwise very unremarkable closet, but his son was nowhere to be seen. The police were called, and the story made its rounds via local news media, but James Paul Sinclair was never seen again. Ethan had never been suspected, and the police listed James as a runaway. Life after James was much easier for Ethan, serene even. No one bothered him or bullied him, and Aunt Samantha and Uncle Hector were so grief-stricken that they barely paid their nephew any attention at all. It gave him incredible freedom to perfect his newfound passion in life, art. After James vanished, Ethan lost all interest in science and instead dove headfirst into art. His grades plummeted in all classes but drawing, and by age 16 he had dropped out of school to focus on his artwork. His specialty, his obsession, was blacklight posters. Ethan grew from a boy into a man, and every day he expected the grim skull to come for him, but it never did. He continued to live with his aunt and uncle until they both died prematurely in their mid-60s. The coroner said a stroke had taken Samantha and a heart attack had felled Hector, but Ethan knew the truth. They'd both died of grief. They had been as good as buried since the night that James disappeared more than 17 years prior. Ethan lived off their inheritance for several years, but after more than a decade, he could no longer afford to keep up payments on the house. Unable to work on anything but his drawings and paintings, he'd applied for welfare and public assistance. He limped along that way for a while, but soon he wasn't even able to perform basic hygiene or care for himself in any way, his art consuming all of his time. He ended up in a state-run psychiatric facility. Not that he was complaining. He liked the center. It was clean, his bed was soft, and he was allowed to sit quietly and draw all day. Of course, sometimes he had outbursts. Luckily, the nurses had medication that calmed him. Without the medication to soothe him, Ethan would have killed himself long ago. The outbursts often came when he thought about James, whose life had been ruined by his little cousin's mere existence. Ethan saw James every day, not in the ward or in the cafeteria, but in his paintings. James's image emerged from the trunks of trees and on the tops of mushrooms. Sometimes he even showed up on the petals of flowers. The face was always contorted and tormented, a mask of misery. James appeared most frequently with the other faces in the Grim Skull's cloak of victims, since that was the subject that Ethan focused on the most. Ethan liked to decorate his room with his posters, even though they frightened some of the nurses. Sometimes he joked with the young women and assured them that his paintings didn't bite, because even though he knew that they could and did, he also knew that they wouldn't, because they didn't need to. The Grim Skull had him to do its bidding and didn't need anyone else. The years crept by. Ethan's brown hair grayed, his smooth cheeks wrinkled, and his steady hand started to shake. Still he drew, he painted, he created. When he was in his 40s, the stomach pain started and persisted. The hospital doctor eventually ran some tests and told him that he had stomach cancer. Ethan wasn't surprised. Frankly, he was amazed that he had lived as long as he had.
It showed mercy to me. It let me live longer than I needed. Some kind of thanks for agreeing to carry its burden.
On the night after he received his diagnosis, Ethan taped the old Grim Skull poster on the door of his room. Then he lay down to sleep. Within an hour, he heard the Grim Skull calling his name. Ethan was ready. He rose from his bed, opened the door, and descended down the stairs, out of his world and into the other dimension, to take his place as the wearer of the cloak and the collector of souls within the Neon realm. Ethan's disappearance was a source of both mystery and shame to the mental facility where he had resided. No one understood how he had simply gotten up and walked away. He wasn't violent, and so the ward wasn't high security, but there were still safety protocols, and how no alarms went off was more than perplexing. It was downright unnerving. Orderly Georgia Harrison was particularly upset by Ethan's disappearance. She had liked him. She'd even liked his creepy artwork. The blacklit posters might have gone out of style before she was old enough to tie her own shoes, but it still looked cool. 2 months after Ethan's disappearance, the investigation started to wane, and rumors started to circulate that Ethan had simply traveled elsewhere. Most of the staff believed that he would eventually turn up in some homeless shelter, cold and hungry and broke and sick, begging to come back. Georgia had a weird conviction that Ethan was gone for good. Eventually, they started cleaning out his room. Georgia couldn't bear the idea of his detailed artwork lying in a trash heap, so she gathered it up and brought it all home. One piece in particular got her attention. It had been taped to the back of Ethan's door and depicted a grinning skeleton draped in a purple robe with a pile of skulls at its feet. It was like most of Ethan's work, except there was something deeper to it, something familiar. Maybe it's the smirk, she mused. Whatever it was, it sent shivers down her spine, but she was sure her son would love it. After all, Randy was into horror movies, and he was quite the budding artist himself.
Chilling tales for dark nights.